All right, our first speaker is Tomas Aguirre, AI exposure and adaptive capacity for American workers.
Hello, my name is Tomas Aguirre. It's an immense privilege to be opening the second day of presentations. Today I'm going to present my work that I've written with Sam Manning called AI Exposure and the Adaptive Capacity of American Workers. Sam really wished to be here today, but he's having his fourth baby any day or hour now, so I hope to represent him well. So, the context of this paper is that there is a lot of discussion about AI-induced job displacement. Leading figures in the Silicon Valley and Washington are deeply concerned about this. Darren Moday, I think I'm the fourth presentation to cite Darren Moday, but Darren Moday said that AI could wipe out 50% of all entry-level white-collar roles within the next 5 years. Barack Obama has shared these concerns, and the Trump administration AI action plan mentions ideas to better tracking AI adoption in the economy with a special concern for job displacement. When you ask the public as well, they are deeply concerned about AI increasing unemployment, and roughly 1/3 of American workers are personally concerned about being displaced by AI, while AI control and alignment also shows up in those surveys. Usually, unemployment is the major concern that are on people's head. So the research question of this paper is, if AI causes job displacement, who will struggle the most? And who will be able to adapt? We don't take instances on opinions on how fast or what will be the magnitude of job displacement, but rather we ask ourselves, if the displacement indeed happens, who will face the most significant displacement costs? For this, we construct an index of adaptive capacity to job displacement. The goal here is to identify which workers are best positioned to adapt if they are displaced to AI, and build a policy to also try to see whether there are vulnerable pockets. To achieve those goals, we bridge two main literatures. The first one is the AI exposure literature. Various papers building on task-based frameworks introduced by David Alter in 2003 with colleagues have tried to measure how different tasks are exposed to LLMs and map them to occupations. One of the first papers to do this specifically to AI is from Brynjolfsson and colleagues that creates a measure of suitability for machine learning in which they match on-net tasks to various capabilities of machine learning technology of the time. Elundun and colleagues, including Sam Manning, made updates of this kind of research for GPT-4 level LLMs. Those papers usually show that high-income workers have a higher AI exposure, and they roughly indicate the likelihood of job transformation. It's important to highlight that not all transformation will take the shape of displacement, as we can see in frameworks such as Simulon and Restrepo 2019. New technology can deepen automation, can create entirely new tasks, can augment workers, and sometimes it can also displace workers. Because of this, we discussed the displacement cost literature. Here, one of the seminal papers is Jacobson, Lalonde, Sullivan, 1993, in which they show a percentage scaring of people when they get laid off from their jobs. The effect size vary quite a bit, but they can have a very big magnitude of like 10 to 20% decrease in wage prospectus decades after displacement. There are various ways of explaining this. The most common way is loss of human capital specificity, either for a specific industry or a specific firm or a specific occupation that the worker was at. There are highly heterogeneous effects, that is highlighted, for instance, in recent work by Susan Ette and colleagues studying the Swedish labor market, and various labor market failures amplify those costs, such as coordination failures, in which enough firms or workers internalize all the benefits of reskilling, and liquidity constraints, as, for instance, Barrage and SORSI 2024 highlight. We bring these literatures together by building a measure of adaptive capacity to job displacement and then comparing this to AI exposure. The core idea here is simple. Two workers might face the same AI exposure but have vastly different ability to adapt if displaced. It's a novel initial attempt to create an index as this. We choose simple methodology, mainly for transparency and reproducibility, which has its limitations. I will discuss in the limitations sections. It's quite policy relevant. Various policymakers have a pretty clear demand of such an index, and it covers about 300 occupations, or 92% of the US workforce. We define adaptive capacity as the ability of workers to navigate involuntary job transitions and reduce welfare costs of displacement. The four key components that we use for this, that we selected from literature, is the worker's age profile, the skill transferability to other occupations, the access to liquid financial resources, and the measure of geographic employment density. I'll do a quick overview of those components and then go to the findings and conclusions. Example may be useful. You can think of a younger software developer with a ton of savings in San Francisco, which is a city with vast opportunities, and it's pretty clear that he has way higher adaptive capacity than our older clerk or office clerk that works perhaps in a small Mountain West city. We formalize this in the index. We first build this measure. We combine those four key components that we identify from the literature. We create this occupational level index after crosswalking various data sets and do standard transformations, and compare this to AI exposure to them, identify key patterns of resilience and vulnerability. Our main finding is actually good news. AI exposure and adaptive capacity are positively correlated, which means that on average, people that are more exposed to AI are also the people that are better positioned to adapt if this displacement translate, if this AI exposure translates into displacement. On the top exposure, top adaptive capacity, there are various managerial and professional occupations. Think, for instance, product managers or financial analysts. Here in more detail, the example of a software developer versus an office clerk. While they have roughly the same AI exposure, the adaptive capacity of a software developer is way higher because they have much more savings. They are usually younger and usually work in more thick local job markets. Both have roughly the same skill transferability, surprisingly, but because of all the different advantages, the software developers have roughly 99% of adaptive capacity, while office clerks only 26%. So the four key components that we use are age, net liquid wealth, skill transferability, and geographic density. The first one, perhaps the least controversial, is age. Same Jacobson literature consistently shows that high-tenured older workers face most substantial displacement costs. Atte's paper shows that this is perhaps the most relevant factor, together with job routineness content. And other papers shows that the earning losses of older workers persist much longer than for younger workers. They usually have higher human capital specific to firm or industry, like accountant that worked in the same industry for 20 years, for instance, are less able to adapt because they have stronger ties to a specific location and has less incentive to train, because when you're 58, you have less incentive to gain new abilities than when you're 28. There is some evidence for younger workers too. There is a specifically working paper that argues that there is a U-shaped correlationship between displacement cost and age, but since the most consolidated literature shows roughly linear effect, we choose this as our main specification and only test other specifications in the appendices. The second component is net liquid wealth. Various papers have shown that workers with more access to liquid resources, that's their assets minus home equity, vehicle equity, and business equity, and credit card debit, for instance, they usually are able to afford longer searches for a new job if they get displaced. And this has a clear welfare benefit for them because they are able to remove consumption. There is counterintuitively a mixed effect on job quality. Usually the papers find small positive, but sometimes not significant effects on downstream job quality of more net liquid savings, but we can see in other dimensions net liquid savings helping quite a bit, such as job security, protection during downturns, such as a pandemic or recessions, as Cartelli papers discuss for net worth in general, not only liquid savings. And there are various other good outcomes, such as health and well-being outcomes. The third component is skill transferability. Gayton and Schoenberg introduced a measure of skill transferability that's based on cosine similarity between two occupations by taking in this specific study, the tasks that they perform using German data. And this became standard in the literature. And they show that workers that transition to similar occupations face substantially lower costs when they transition to occupations that have a vastly different skill set. Various other papers have reproduced this finding, showing that, for instance, a 10 percentage point increase in transferability causes 1 to 4% lower earning losses. Engelberg papers specifically argue that there is a trade-off between skill specificity that's usually associated with higher wages and skill transferability that is usually associated with slightly lower ages, but better handle involuntary transitions and displacement. We do a slight changing in their measure to weight for growth projections, to weight more heavily if a person is able to transition to growing occupations rather than declining occupations, also consistent with the evidence that if you are displaced from declining occupations, you suffer much more. The last one is geographic density. Dense urban areas help workers handle transitions much better. Beckley and Lin, for instance, shows that younger workers are much more able to switch occupations in kind of exploit phase, while older workers are much more able to, when they get displaced, to switch to the same or similar occupation, which is associated with lower displacement costs. There are various ways of explaining this, but usually the simplest way is that you simply have access to a larger pool of jobs and are able to find better job matches. Someone that gets displaced in New York have a much easier time than someone that's displaced in a small town. So we crosswalk these major and merge these data sets from SOC, SIP, sensors, different codes. We standardize each component, converting these to z-scores. We take a simple mean of those z-scores and then convert these to percentiles. When I say, for instance, that our office clerk have 0.26 of adaptive capacity, this means that they are only better positioned than 26% of other workers in the workforce if they get displaced. This approach values simplicity, reproducibility, and transparency with various limitations, and we also test to various other alternative specifications in your appendix, with the main findings being robust, mainly of the adaptive capacity and AI exposure being positively correlated. We apply standard transformations to this, for instance, taking the log of net liquid wealth and also taking the log of density, as is common in economies of agglomeration literature, before taking this discourse. And for AI exposure measure, we use one of the measures from Elandun et al. 2024, covering 300 occupations and 92% of the US workforce. The components capture different dimensions. They have weakly to moderate correlations between themselves. I will go quick over this. And we find this positive correlation with wide variation. People that are usually on the top exposure, on top of the capacity, are mostly in professional and managerial occupations. But you can see this. You can see this on the table. For instance, software developers and other mathematical science occupations have a pretty high exposure, but also a pretty high adaptive capacity. But as you can see, there is also substantial pockets of vulnerability of people that are both top quartile in exposure and bottom quartile in adaptive capacity. Those occupations are mainly administrative support and clerical roles, such as payroll and timekeeping clerks, and claim adjusters and investigators. They are characterized by being routine information processing occupations that AI can increasingly handle, by having relatively old workforces and relatively low skill transferability to other occupations, especially when we wait for growth. Consider, for instance, a medical secretary with low savings, low transferability, and also aged, for instance, 60 years old. These groups of top exposure, burden adaptive capacity composes 5% of the US workforce. And it represents a group that, if policymakers are interested in targeting adjustment policies, perhaps they should focus on. We can also see geographic patterns, such as small cities and college towns dominating, especially in the Mountain West and Midwest. So, going to the limitations of this index, first is a simple index, mainly for transparency. But obviously, there is various limitations of this. We could have taken an approach of estimating this based on detailed displacement data. This would also have its issues like external validity concerns, but would surely better weight each component. And this is an approach that we would like to see more in the future as well. But we've chosen this, given the importance of creating such a measure quickly and not having that much detailed administrative data. The second limitation is that occupational level indexes naturally masks within occupational heterogeneity. Some software developers have way less liquid savings than others, have much more broad skills than others, and any occupation level index will naturally miss this variation. Finally, AI exposure and AI doesn't necessarily mean AI displacement. We just assume that if you take AI exposure as a proxy for AI displacement, such as many people do, you should be focused on the people that have lower adaptive capacity. Finally, this index is mostly useful for short-term and middle-term AI adjustment policies, not radically transformed AI scenarios such as a post-labor economy, for instance, that fundamentally restricts the economy. But it's useful for the transformations that we are already seeing in labor markets. So just to sum up, we identify these 4 key factors: net liquid wealth, skill transferability, age, and geographic density, as the ones from the literature that most shapes the cost of displacement. We find that AI exposure and adaptive capacity are positively correlated, specifically among the top quartile AI exposure, more than 2/3 have above median adaptive capacity, but we also find substantial heterogeneity with 5% of the workforce being both high exposure and low adaptive capacity, especially concentrated in small Mountain West and Midwest towns. So these adaptive capacity indexes can help review both areas of resilience and concentrated pockets of vulnerability, can help to target occupations and geographic regions for policy interventions, and can help inform more displacement research. And it's an illustration of the kind of research that me and Sam would be really happy to see more on the future and further develop this approach. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be presenting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Okay, great. It's a pleasure to be here. My comments largely reflect the previous version of the paper because I only got the paper on Tuesday, but I think there are more still less apply. Okay, so in a nutshell, what they're doing is they're creating a measure of vulnerability or adaptive capacity that includes a set of elements like liquid wealth, some measures of skill transferability, age, and geographic density, and they're showing that across occupations, the occupations that have higher predicted AI exposure, they're also better able to withstand displacement. So that's true for most, not all, but the punchline is pretty optimistic. Okay, so we think we shouldn't worry too much about it. The unemployed software developers at Google, they're going to be just fine. Okay, I don't largely disagree with the premise. I have a few quibbles on the index, but mostly I want to focus on big picture comments. So my only thing is that it seems odd to exclude housing to the extent that for most households in the US, housing is a primary form of saving. I understand it's not as liquid, but maybe you want to show some results with housing as well. Okay, so my first comment is, what exactly does AI exposure mean in terms of displacement? Okay, so I think it's not entirely obvious that occupations whose tasks can be done by AI are necessarily going to face lower labor demand going forward, because there's a number of offsetting effects. So if you think of a framework where an occupation can do multiple tasks, and then AI can do some of these tasks very well, this may actually not be bad for the worker because it allows them to reallocate effort to tasks that are not exposed. So if I have an AI that does a really good job reimbursing my conference receipts, that frees me up time to write more papers. At the same time, there's a Baumol effect, which is if AI adoption increases the productivity of the firm, or the firm grows faster, let's say develops more products, that may increase labor demand across the board. So to the extent that people that work, that are exposed to AI also are employed in fast-growing firms, this may also generate an offsetting demand. Now, I find it really, really hard to make predictions about the future. It's much easier to make predictions about the past. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some related work that we've done, but caveat here, when I talk about AI, it's first generation AI. It's what people called AI back in 2010. Okay, so I replaced AI with machine learning. So what we did is we used data from Revelio, and we went to the descriptions of people that work in developing AI. We extracted what these people said they're doing on their resumes, and then basically examined how these applications correlate in a semantic similarity sense with tasks that different occupations perform. Okay, so what you're seeing here is that, yes, occupations that are more highly paid tend to be more exposed to AI. Okay, that, however, doesn't necessarily imply that there's a decrease in labor demand. So we had this simple theoretical framework that basically showed that what matters for labor demand is not just the average exposure of your task to AI, but also the degree to which this exposure is concentrated to specific tasks. So then what you're seeing here is that, yes, on average, high average exposure is associated with falling employment growth. These regressions are run at the firm occupation level. However, there are offsetting factors. Then, when you aggregate these results. And let's be very clear, these are all identifying relative effects. There's a missing intercept problem. We're going to say nothing about overall general equilibrium effects. This is only saying how the employment shares changed in response to machine learning back in the day. So yes, if you're just focusing on the coefficients from average exposure, you're going to see that the more highly paid workers are going to be facing higher labor displacement. However, there's an offsetting effect because much of that AI exposure is concentrated in a subset of tasks. And because workers are free to reallocate their time across tasks, this may actually mitigate the overall effect. There's an additional channel that is these highly exposed workers are employed in firms that are adopting AI, and these firms are growing faster than firms that don't adopt AI. So once you average all the effects together, once you take the overall effect, you're actually seeing that these occupations that were mostly exposed to AI, they actually face slightly higher labor demand than occupations lower exposed to AI. Okay? So point number one, AI exposure need not be the same thing as declining labor demand. Point number two, what happens to the worker can be very different than what happens to an occupation. Okay? Just because the occupation sees an increase or a decrease in labor demand, this doesn't necessarily mean that the worker is going to be facing the same effect. And there's a variety of channels. So for example, you can think of AI as having an augmenting role where it can increase the demand for certain occupations, but those tasks, those new tasks may actually require skills that the incumbent workers don't have. Okay, so maybe we're all going to be using GPT-6 to write papers, but maybe I haven't figured out how to do it. This is going to be benefiting younger workers relative to me. At the same time, there's an offsetting effect, which is workers can switch out of occupations that are facing declines in labor demand. And you can also think these switching costs vary with worker characteristics. Now, again, I find it hard to make predictions about the future, but I can think about what happened in the past. So this is some related work that we did with a similar set of co-authors. And what we did now is we looked at patent data, and we looked at how similar patents are to occupation task descriptions. And we distinguished between two different types of tasks, routine tasks and non-routine tasks. And the assumption was that technologies that are related to non-routine tasks were labor augmenting, whereas technologies that were related to routine tasks were labor saving. So if you run a regression at the occupation level, this is at the occupation industry level, you're seeing this. Okay? So once you have a higher instance of labor-saving technologies for a specific industry, a specific occupation, you see a decline in the total wage bill. Whereas if you see an increased instance of labor-augmenting technologies, you see an increase in labor demand. Okay, that's at the occupation level. What happens to the worker, though, doesn't need to be quite the same. So then what we did is we'll link those exposures to administrative tax data in the US, and then we can actually track exactly what happens to these workers. And then what you're seeing is that there's a heterogeneous effect for the impact of labor-augmenting technologies. So for the labor-saving technologies, they have labor demand falls at the occupation. If you track individual workers, they experience a decline in earnings. If you're focusing on labor-augmenting technologies, even though occupation labor demand grows, the incumbent workers actually facing a weak decline in earnings. Okay, how does that work? Well, someone has to gain is at the new entrants. And then you can cut this analysis by different characteristics. So one thing we focus on is age. And then what you're seeing is that older workers, they experience a larger decline in earnings in response to labor-augmenting technologies than younger workers. Again, this speaks to the skill displacement effect. Whereas if you look at labor-saving technologies, we didn't see much difference. We also did this as a function of the workers' income relative to their peers. Okay, so this is how much am I paid relative to other finance professors. And then we saw that more highly paid workers actually experience a larger decline in earnings, which kind of makes sense because you're starting from a higher base. Okay, so how does this relate to this paper? I think it would be helpful to think about what By the way, do I have time, or am I?
2 minutes?
2 minutes, okay.
Oh, 1 minute, a little over 1 minute. And
Okay.
Elsa's got a sign in the back.
Okay. Okay, so there are basically two types of displacement from technology, or there are multiple ways how technology can displace workers. One is falling labor demand. The other one is if there are just simply new skills required that incumbent workers don't have. So going back to the paper, I think it would help if you actually were to connect the measures of adaptive capacity to actual measure or predicted worker displacement, rather than what we think it might happen to the occupation in terms of its AI exposure. Now, why would that matter? Well, because of some of the elements in that index are actually correlated with a degree of exposure, right? So if I have higher income, I'm more likely going to have higher liquid wealth. Okay, I think that's all I have, and thanks.